Right. Good morning. And our assignment today is to discuss the major critiques of the Enlightenment, both during the tenure of the Enlightenment and beyond. And this is going to be a rather long spread, so you will have to excuse me when I try and sort of put in a lot of ideas and a lot of history also, or a history of ideas, into one short lecture. Now, as you see, the Enlightenment had its three phases. We had the early Enlightenment beginning with the early 17th century onwards. It had the middle Enlightenment approximately from 1700 to 1740s, where some of the most important ideas of the Enlightenment, especially about reason, were bandied about. And finally, we had the late Enlightenment, which talked about the limits of reason, which talked about the methodologies of reason also, and sort of dissolved into the rise of the French Revolution and the consequent rise of Romanticism. So that would be the late Enlightenment. So we have distinct phases of the Enlightenment, as it were, as part of this, large corpus of historical dates. Now, one of the first things I should sort of inform you is that the critique of the Enlightenment was generated within the Enlightenment as well. So if the Enlightenment is seen as a movement which led to rationality, to the application of rationality in all the disciplines, the rise of liberty, the rise of democracy, the rise of political progress, the rise of science, then one of the critiques of the Enlightenment comes through Hume and the rise of sensibility and sentiment. So Hume and Adam Smith were moving away from the doctrines of Cartesian logical reasoning and method, especially propagated by Descartes and Locke. And therefore, the first critique of the Enlightenment, I would say, would come from within the Enlightenment about the rise of a sensibility and sentiment. Having said that, there was already a powerful backlash against the Enlightenment within the early Enlightenment itself, especially through religion. Although, as you have seen, Newtonian Enlightenment ideas tried to amalgamate rationality with religion through deism and a latitudinarian Christianity. But many of the early thinkers or many of the Enlightenment clerics were quick to recognize that the Enlightenment was largely impinging upon the idea of a revealed religion, miracles, and therefore denuding the power of the church. Also important for these clerics and these thinkers was the gradual replacement of science, or the gradual replacement of, God and religion by science and rationality was creating a sense of very powerful sense of human pride. Now, when you read your Swift, I reminded you, Swift is one of these voices, one of these very skeptical voices, which talks about Enlightenment rationality as breeding a kind of a confidence and a pride in human nature, which he found extremely problematic. In fact, he strenuously disagrees against the idea of the animal rationale and suggests that humanity is only rationis capax, right? On the other hand, in his works, he often shows humanity to be only animal or omni-animal, as he pointed out. So in the final image of Gulliver's Travels, if you remember the book 4, where through his reason, Gulliver is led to a kind of solipsism where he sort of moves away from the faithful wife and children and decides to live with the horses and finds pleasure and peace with the horses, suggests that reason by itself and the pride in human reason is a solipsistic force that isolates human beings from society. So there are two critiques emerging within the Enlightenment. One, which is led by the traditionalists, which sees reason and the new confidence in human methodology of reasoning as essentially corrupting man and creating a sense of false pride. The other was through the enlightenment of feelings and emotions, as it were, which sees not only reason as a path to truth, but equally the validity of feeling, sensibility also as a way of truth. In fact, both Adam Smith and Hume were very skeptical about the idea and the possibility of rationality as being the only method to truth. So this is the critique of the Enlightenment from within the Enlightenment, as it were. But you'll have to remember, therefore, that what I'm saying is that there were many enlightenments rather than one single enlightenment itself. But the Enlightenment did move away from blindness of faith, dogma, revealed religion, miracles, and tried to create a process. Now, this, interestingly, was the first argument, this process that, you could arrive at a very scientific, geometric process of classifying human nature, of explaining through the mechanistic universe, through the principles of mechanics and physics, you could explain the workings of society and human beings and behavior of human beings. This mechanistic view of the universe and the supremacy of the power of reason was the first thrust against which the late 18th century moved against. And we see the rise of what Isaiah Berlin in a 1973 book has titled The Counter-Enlightenment through the rise of three major philosophers, all of whom belonged to the German speaking language. And the first of all of these is, of course, the philosopher called Vico. Now, Vico's philosophy, and Vico wrote a treatise which was as early as 1725, mind you, was titled Scienza Nuova, or the New Science. And Vico suggests that, enlightenment is only one path of truth. And he talks about the method of living, as it were, rather than trying to create a rational pattern for all existence. So the geometrical method in practical life, and this is one of Vico's very famous quotations, is like trying to go mad within the rules of reason, right? So it's suggesting that only a way of looking at a life through rationality and geometry is an insane method. And he suggests that language, reason, passion, imagination, and history, these are rather also forces through which human life can be, or human philosophy can be known. So language is the way through which one perceives life, and therefore passion, imagination, history, and conventional wisdom, practical conventional wisdom, which has been received through history, is also a method of understanding human existence. Therefore, we have Vico classifying human history in three ways. He says there are three ages of human history. He calls it the age of the gods. He calls the second age the age of the heroes, and finally the age of man. But there's always a movement of cyclical history and the perception of human existence through these plural modes of thinking. So Vico is moving away from a monism of reason, or one unidimensional method of looking at truth through reason, and suggesting that there is also, or there are also, alternative intuitive ways of looking at human existence through passion and through these cyclical movements of history, and also through received wisdom of the folk. Now, this idea is one of the founding ideas, you will see, of Romanticism especially. And you will find that Vico was a major influence on many, many philosophers, not only the Romantic philosophers. Coleridge was especially influenced, as was Nietzsche later on, and even you have critics like Edward Said, who was greatly indebted to the philosophy of Vico. So, intuition, spontaneity, rather than merely geometrical and mechanistic reason, is one of the ways through which the first tendencies of counter enlightenment were being generated. Now, this was taken up once again in the work of another philosopher, another German philosopher, Johan Hamann, Hamann. So Vico, Hamann. And Hamann, he talks about, once again, he depreciates, or he sort of criticizes rationality and says, I look upon logical proof. That's an interesting quotation which I found out. I look upon logical proof the way a well-bred girl looks upon a love letter, right? So with a lot of what you can say derision, as it were. Now Hamann takes a different route. Hamann suggests that the way to truth is through a faith in God, enthusiasm, revelation, miracles, and worship. So he suggests that it is faith and belief that determines human actions, right? So between Vico and Hamann, we are actually moving away from this from this faith in reason to a faith in God, to a faith in intuitiveness, revelation, visionary quality, and therefore deeply impacting the rise of German Romanticism. The last philosopher of this trinity, whom actually Isaiah Berlin talks about in the Counter-Enlightenment, is Johann Gottfried Herder. Now, Herder in 1772 publishes the treatise on the origin of language and writes about the poet as a creator of the national awakening, and he talks about language as being the agent of thought, and language is the one which constitutes the pattern of thought. Vico talks about the importance of folk traditions. In fact, the German word for folk, as many of you know, is V-O-L-K, Volk. And he suggests that even the king and the peasant belong to this idea of the folk, of the Volk rather, and nationalism and patriotism therefore become very important aspects of Herder's idea. But Herder's importance lies in the fact that he suggests that all knowledge resides within the soul, and that knowledge can be accessed through sensuous and intuitive perception. Therefore, you have a primitive truth and a derivative truth. Primitive truth, which is accessible by the folk through sensuous and intuitive perception. A derivative truth, which is accessed by reason, logical thought. And and Herder tries to make a bridge between this reason and feeling. And therefore, we have within these three philosophers, therefore, a movement which is away from the philosophers-led, coherent, rational, logical methodology of thinking to a more folk-oriented, primitive, intuitive, faith and soul-based movement towards the perception of truth. Now, put this within what the Germans would call the Sturm and Drang movement. The Sturm and Drang movement, or the storm and stress movement, that most of you have already talked about this in your in your classes on romanticism. If you have not, I suggest you immediately take a look at this. The Sturm and Drang movement, which talks about intuitiveness, which talks about the wave and of powerful feelings. It talks about the encroachment of nightmare and stress upon the universe, and it creates a music and a literature that uses extremes of emotion to move the reader. Now, the most important figure of this Sturm and Drang movement is, of course, Goethe. And Goethe's poems, of course, give us an idea into this emotional excess, this generation of fear, anxiety, the use of the Gothic, the use of the sublime. And this is very important once again, the use of the sublime, the poetic sublime, to generate a sensation that is beyond the rational. So the extra rational is something that comes in through this movement and part of German Romanticism. And please remember that this would influence the movement very greatly, the British Romantic movement very greatly, in the sense that it would lead to the poetry of Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley. Even later on, Coleridge, of course, becomes a very important figure, and you think about the Ancient Mariner and the way in which the Sturm and Drang movement influenced Coleridge's ideas. Right. So the movement against the Enlightenment in literature and philosophy can be seen to move away from reason within the late 19th and the late 18th and the early 19th centuries. Now, incidentally, by the late 18th century also, there's a conservative movement against the Enlightenment, especially in the writings of Edmund Burke. Now, Burke, and this is generated by, the movement against the reign of terror that was generated by the French Revolution. Burke actually talks about the revolution as being spurred by the philosophers of the Enlightenment, and therefore Burke suggests that the Enlightenment is a harbinger only and only of anarchy. In fact, at the same time, if you remember our Tom Paine discussions, Paine is talking about the futility of all governments and rebellion. Therefore, Burke's idea about the revolution as anarchic, and therefore the Enlightenment as leading towards anarchy, is one of the conservative backlashes against the Enlightenment. Burke was also supported in this effort across the continent by Joseph de Maistre, who also argued on the same lines. Right, so it's interesting. Within the Enlightenment, we have two kinds of responses. One, very demonstrably by the philosophers of sensibility. We have one by religion and religious conservatives. We have, at the end of the century, a German movement in philosophy against rationality, led by Vico, Herder, and Hamann, and its consequent effects on poetry, music, literature. And we also have a conservative backlash against the Enlightenment in the philosophy of Burke and Maistre. Right, so you see, already by the time the Enlightenment has actually the age of Enlightenment has come to a close, there have been serious reservations about the Enlightenment through a number of perspectives. Now, of course, the other person who brings this entire discourse against the Enlightenment once again to the forefront is a philosopher who, in many ways, initiates modernity into the 19th century, and that is Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche has a number of ideas which are very difficult to talk about in a span of a very few minutes, but let us talk about Nietzsche's concept of the world as divided into the Apollonian world of reason and the Dionysian world of excesses. And Nietzsche suggests that there is the will to power which is dominant within the human beings, and Nietzsche also talks about perspectivism, that knowledge is contingent and conditional, dependent on fluid perspectives. So Nietzsche is taking out, as it were, from the Enlightenment its universalist, singular perspective, right, of rationality and certain abstract ideas as applicable to all human conditions. And Nietzsche is linking this or decrying this and moving away towards what he calls this perspectivism, that knowledge is contingent upon situations and is also contingent upon the human will to power. And Nietzsche, rather than dare to know, Nietzsche talks about become what you are. And therefore, Nietzsche also talks about, rather than the Enlightenment man of moderation and reason, he will be talking about this Übermensch and the Dionysian spirit, be announcing the death of God, of course, but instead of God, he will talk about this Dionysian superhero, as it were, who is almost an anti-Enlightenment figure. And this, once again, through Nietzsche, initiates a movement against anti-Cartesianism and the anti-Cartesian movement, which will become the center in many ways of the modernists and later on of existential philosophy. Now, one of the philosophers whom we need to talk about, although not a philosopher, but who actually takes the Enlightenment into the modern century or the period of modernism, is Karl Marx. And once again, while Marx sees the class deficiencies of the Enlightenment, Marx's idea about the revolution of the proletariat, the revolution of the proletariat against the bourgeois and the creation of an utopian world, the dictatorship of the proletariat that Marx talks about the establishment of a class structure, or the abolishing of the class structure, as it were, and the creation of the commune and the generation of a kind of a universal beneficial system, is one of the continuities of the Enlightenment. So far, we've talked about the discontinuities, but in Marx, we see the idea of the Enlightenment in a new shape. Where we see the movement away from the Enlightenment is in the existential philosophy. Now, the existentialists, of course, decry the precedence of essence over existence, and they foreground existence over essence. Now, in many ways, the Enlightenment was establishing certain codes and discourses of essence, of liberty, of a democracy, of a certain amount of scientific explanation and rationality, of a Cartesian way of cognition. Now, what the existentialists do is to take away this cognitive Cartesianism altogether and establish absurdity, nothingness, and alienation. So the most sustained attack against the Enlightenment actually comes through the existentialists with their explosion of the absurd, with their establishment of the absurd, the nothingness, and alienation, and therefore the precedence of existence, the bare minimal existence over any theories of essence. So the most significant challenge against the Enlightenment, as it were, comes from this discourse of the existentialists. Right. So already we are looking at, and of course you must have understood that by the early modernist period, you have the several discourses which are challenging the Cartesian, mode of perfect rationality. You have the Freudian explanation of the human mind. You have the Heisenbergian uncertainty principle. You have Einstein's theory of relativity. So this concept of abstract reasoning as leading us to truth is something that is taken apart very consciously within the modernist movement, as it were. But even the modernists still try to go back to myth and create a pattern of order and semblance. But the next major challenge to the Enlightenment, or we'll call it the next major challenge of the Enlightenment, comes through a 1944 book by Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer titled The Dialectic of Enlightenment. Now, in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, what Horkheimer and Adorno suggests is that reason by itself, or the Enlightenment by itself, can create certain abstract potentials or abstract ideas which in many ways become tyrannical and are utilized by false ideologies to establish one dormant normative mode of thinking. And Adorno and Horkheimer are, of course, relating this with the Nazi philosophy that has swept Europe at this point of time. Now, Adorno and Horkheimer therefore suggest that in creating these ideologies based on a kind of rationality, and they suggest that rationality therefore can be hijacked in many ways to create these narratives, that reason becomes, and they suggest that Enlightenment can become myth, and myth can become the Enlightenment. So the Dialectic of Enlightenment is a text that shows how rationality, rational thought, abstract principles can become hijacked or can become subservient to the cause of dominant powers. Now, part of Adorno and Horkheimer's book also talks about the culture industry and the way in which the culture industry takes over, reiterates certain patterns of thought, and therefore introduces or uses reason as a kind of a as a kind of a mechanism, the tyranny of reason and the pretense of reason, as it were, to establish very many theories which hold human beings within its power, and therefore subservient to state power, subservient to cultural power. Interestingly, one of the philosophers of the Frankfurt School is, of course, also this school of philosophers which establishes itself which is established in Frankfurt. One of the other philosophers is, of course, Jurgen Habermas. And Habermas tries to counter Adorno and Horkheimer's theory by arguing that the Enlightenment is not a finished project, but is a process of continuity, an argument, of course, that Kant had made earlier. And therefore, Enlightenment is an unfinished project, as it were, but Habermas's major book talks about the structural transformation of the public sphere and how the Enlightenment did indeed create a process of reason, public use of reason, and therefore the Enlightenment cannot be dismissed in these mere terms. Now, the next challenge to the Enlightenment actually comes from the postmodernists, and especially, the ways in which three major philosophers work. The first, of course, is Jean-Pierre Badrillard. Badrillard talks about the ways in which simulation occurs, in which media can simulate the truth. So he gives the example of Disneyland, for example, where you suspend the truth at the gate, a reality at the gate, and you enter into a hyper-real universe which can be manufactured. And for Baudrillard, therefore, there is a potential where the entire truth can be illusory. The entire concept of the real can be illusory and simulated. The most major philosopher, of course, of the postmodern era, who talks about the discourses as grand narratives, is Lyotard. Now, Jean-François Lyotard, of course, talks about history and the Enlightenment as having created certain grand narratives of reason, of progress, of liberty, and therefore of technological progress. In fact, Lyotard talks about human beings in relation with technology as Gulliver was with relationship to truth, neither either too big or too small, but never at the right size. And Lyotard suggests that human beings are always suspended within these grand narratives, and therefore it is important that we interrogate these grand narratives in favor of smaller micro narratives. So history as a grand narrative, the history of progress, science, technology as these grand narratives, Marxism as this grand narrative from which we must bring ourselves out. Of course, there's also the philosopher Frederick Jameson, who talks once again about the ideology of late capitalism, where he will talk about the way in which technology creates a capitalism which is beyond the industrial, right? And he's looking at the reality of post-industrial capitalism and the way in which Enlightenment becomes subservient to this ideology, right? Now, that is the postmodern critique, therefore. So if you take this and you see the postmodernists as trying to figure out the ways in which reason hijacked several narratives, I suggest you go to Foucault. Right. Now, Foucault suggests that reason created this normative discourse, this kind of a history, what Foucault will call genealogy, through which certain modes and patterns of thought were concerned rational, and the others were dismissed as irrational and therefore insane. So this question about sanity, about reason and unreason, is Foucault's dominant thesis in his discourse on reason, on the birth of reason, as he suggests that the only process through which power operates, and Nietzsche also talked about power. So from Nietzsche to Foucault, it's a quite an interesting leap. It suggests that all knowledge systems are dominated by power structures, and that the history of human beings, or the history of human systems, has always been a history of exclusion, of normatizing, and the exclusion of certain ways and modes of alternate beliefs. Now, Foucault takes this in various institutions. In The Birth of the Clinic, he talks about how, a specialized discipline of medicine has talked about certain ways of living as diseased, and how when you go to a doctor, you are in a position of infinitely less power. Now, of course, Foucault takes the panopticon idea into the concept of the prison, and how the prisoner becomes a subject of state power. But his most interesting book till date will probably be the 3-volume History of Sexuality, where Foucault suggests how heterosexuality becomes the grand narrative against which all alternative sexualities have been considered as freaks, weird, and so on and so forth. So Foucault is also trying to suggest how the Enlightenment and rationality has been used to create grander narratives through which there has been an exclusionary process, and how reason has become, as Swift warned at one point of time, the handmaid of power, and how discourses of power have enmeshed themselves into the discourses of enlightenment. This is also the thesis of 2 other directions in which enlightenment critiques have moved. One, which has been forwarded by feminists, who have suggested that the Enlightenment has been a dominantly white male perspective, and that women have traditionally been excluded from the processes of enlightenment, and that rationality has been seen exclusively as a male prerogative, and the use of language, the use of various modes of depiction have gradually been taken over by men, and how this this way of intuitive emotional responses to truth have been gradually dismissed. Now, therefore, you have various other philosophers talking about ways of representation, alternative ways of representation. You have the concept of feminine écriture, for example, a different way of using language. And you also have the ways in which the use of the camera has very often been seen as a preeminently male gaze, as objectifying the female body. And therefore, the feminist enlightenment has started from its basic claim of education to, and has moved through ways in which sexuality, the concept of power structures, have been used predominantly by dominant white European males in their establishment of a normative discourse of reason. The final, I would say, argument that I will present today has been the argument of post-coloniality and the way in which it saw enlightenment as essentially creating discourses about race, imperialism, and power. Now, obviously, you will understand that the Enlightenment, while it did talk about slavery and it brought about the end of slavery, was notoriously silent about the rights of the minority, and especially the racial minority, when it came to putting its money on the table, as it were, and that the Enlightenment was a predominantly European phenomenon transforming European society. Non-Western societies were very often, stratified with discourses about race. You had false ideas about evolution, and you had ideas about how, the structures of the skull indicated that Europeans were more developed. So reason was very often hijacked to create discourses of racial superiority. Reason was hijacked to use to create discourses about non-Eastern religions, cultural, anthropological practices as non-rational. And therefore, one of the major discourses of the Enlightenment, which gained a lot of traction and currency, was this civilizing mission of the Enlightenment, where the forces of liberty, equality, progress would be gradually dispersed through the process of colonialism on the unsuspecting or the grateful natives, as it were. And therefore, the Enlightenment built within itself a discourse of racial superiority. You have to look at Robinson Crusoe as a perfect example of how the Enlightenment welded, scientific innovation, racial superiority, discourses of power, civilization within itself, and how it went hand in hand with imperialism, the creation of slavery, and the ruthless exploitations of colonial superiority. Ironically, I would say that many of the discourses of the Enlightenment were later on used by the post-colonialists, and the Bengal Renaissance would be a great example. I often refer to this not as a Bengal Renaissance, but a Bengal Enlightenment, in the ways in which the discourses of Enlightenment, nationalism, progress, the claim to science was used by people like Raja Ram Mohan Roy. The Brahmo Samaj, for example, undertook a lot of, or sort of absorbed a lot of Enlightenment ideas and tried to create its counterpoint through which, the freedom struggle was once again imposed. But you see, the problem with the Bengal Renaissance, once again, was a problem which lay with the Enlightenment, that it was restricted to a certain class of people, and that it very often did not look at the subaltern historiographies and the indigenous ways of thinking, so that it tried to inculcate a modernity which has only become partial. So what I've tried to do, and of course, once again, if you take this even further, then you will find that two of the discourses against the Enlightenment that are coming up in a very big way is the discourse of ecology and eco-criticism, which saw the Enlightenment as situating man at the center of the universe, thereby creating a speciesist dialogue where man was at the center of the species, and for him, all nature could be utilized, scrutinized, classified, and exploited. So the climate crisis and the climate literature that we see, the eco-critical thrust, sees this moment of the Anthropocene, where man had the capacity to alter the balance of the environment within the Enlightenment itself. So the great eco-critical argument against the Enlightenment situates this moment of the Anthropocene as located within the moment of the Enlightenment, as it were. The other major, critical theories that have come up right now is about the very concept of the post-human and the ways in which, the human has been situated within the center of the discourses, and how the animal has been excluded, and how the Enlightenment has led to technological movements where you now have the concept of the transhuman, where you have the human beings who are doctored and who have moved beyond humanity, and the creation of robots, and the question of whether humanity itself will come under threat. So even that discourse is is a discourse that is rooted and looks back at the Enlightenment itself. Now, what was the purpose of today's discussion? The purpose of today's discussion was to look at the ways in which the Enlightenment generated a significant number of critiques. Now, these critiques have ranged from the pre-modern discourses of religion to the postmodern discourses about power structures, environments, and post-human. Now, the Enlightenment created a body of thought. It believed in rationality, it believed in the logical explanation of things, it believed in the possibility of human rationality as transforming politics, economics, and in general, liberating and improving the condition of human beings. Right? It believed in a scientific method of understanding truth, and it believed in the human capacity of understanding as potentially transforming and therefore leading to this grander vision of progress. Now, all these critiques have suggested that there had been incompleteness in the Enlightenment, and that these projects were gradually hijacked through various ways through which the human destiny of the Enlightenment was never reached. Now, in his essay, What is Enlightenment?, Immanuel Kant had asked this question: has man attained the Enlightenment? Kant asked. He says, no, man hasn't, but he's in the process of attaining the Enlightenment, and therefore supporters of the Enlightenment have suggested that these have been rather fallacies in the use of the Enlightenment. And of course, as Habermas has pointed out, that Enlightenment is an incomplete project. It has not ever been completed. But these are some of the directions through which, and some of the critical movements through which the Enlightenment has been critiqued as such. One of the most powerful of them, of course, was the movement of existentialism and postmodernism, and the ways in which the fallacies of abstract theorizations have come into hard collisions with realpolitik and a cynical vision of human nature. However, it is equally true that the Enlightenment remains the touchstone, the theoretical framework to which we return, and that all subsequent critics have in some way or the other reacted to this point of the start of human modernity, where rationality as we see it, where the modern institutions as we see it, where print culture as we see it, the scientific method as we see it, the science of politics and economics that we see, all came into a kind of formation. And for this age of the Enlightenment and the ideas that it generated remain some of the bedrocks within which our modernity, and if you consider our postmodernity, is deeply, deeply embedded. What my course across these few presentations have tried to do is to give you an idea of the major directions in which the Enlightenment moved and how they have impacted our lives subsequently. Please remember that the Enlightenment is known as the age of early modernity. And if modernity is a way of looking at things as approaching our existence, then the Enlightenment and its philosophers, economists, political scientists lived in an age when, across a century and more, human existence underwent a great fermentation, a great and transformative shift, where modernity was adumbrated and anticipated. Of course, the Enlightenment had its fallacies, its incompletenesses, its anxieties, but it is in this dialectics of progress, power structures, that the complexity of the Enlightenment can be fully grasped. So it is with these comments that I bring this general course of lectures on the Enlightenment to a close. And now what we shall do in our subsequent course is to take a look at how these phenomena were articulated in certain texts and philosophy and in the literature of the period. Please remember once again that we could only give you a cross-section of the ideas. There were other many major ideas about human nature, for example, transformations in print culture, in public spheres, for example, which I have not been able to talk about, given the scope of the limited scope of our syllabus. And there will be many more texts which we could have talked about. We will not be able to talk about them. But throughout the course, we expect to give you an idea of a certain cross-section of ideas and literary representations that the Enlightenment was all about. Right. It is with these comments that I bring today's discussion to an end, and I will switch off the recording now, following which you can put forward your questions.